This video is sponsored by Worse Help. Well, if this doesn't earn me the record for the most contentious YouTube title of all time, I don't know what will. But I will die on this hill. I will wage a holy war in the comments section. If you think I'm being hyperbolic, stick with me, because I'm about to show you a rabbit hole that goes so deep, not even the best players in the game fully understand it. Even the game's developers weren't aware of the masterpiece they had created, and it took months for players to discover its true potential. But this weapon also has a dark side, a secret laying just below the surface with the power to disrupt the entire community. This is a video about how a few simple mechanics, both intended and unintended, came together to create something incredible. It's a story about skill expression and fairness, about bugs, exploits, and the lines in between. But most importantly, it's about me talking for 20 minutes about a cool stick I found. So buckle up, drink some water, because I'm about to talk about a hyper niche topic on the internet. I have a very extensive background in gaming, specifically movement games and more specifically movement shooters. Whether it's speedrunning Ghost Runner, tap strafing in Titanfall, or doing anything in Ultra Kill, I usually like to be the guy in the lobby who's pressing the most buttons. So when the finals first dropped, I knew I would probably sink hundreds of hours into finding ways to be the fastest, slipperiest player I could possibly be. And believe me, I did. I think it's safe to say I have at least 100 hours in the practice range.
I got more time in the chow line than you got in the core.
From super gliding to goo launching to prop surfing, I was knee deep in it all. But out of every movement playstyle in the game, one thing stood high above the rest. Meet the sword. At first, very unassuming. You have a light attack that deals 74 damage, and a lunge attack that has to be charged up. This hits for 140 damage, but that isn't its most powerful property. As you'll start to see as we dive deeper, the sword's true power comes from the way its very simple mechanics can be combined in interesting ways. This brings us to the third base mechanic of the sword. Now, calling the dash a base mechanic is a bit of a stretch. It's actually an optional mechanic that comes as part of the light class. But I'm going to stretch that definition much further than that. And as far as conventional wisdom is concerned, for reasons we're going to discuss in a little bit, you have to run the dash when using the sword. On its surface, the dash is pretty simple. If you've seen that video, you already know exactly how this works. But unlike a lot of games, mine included, dashing has one key difference, and once you understand this difference, you'll see how the lunge and the dash combine. In Strata, and games like it, your velocity is set to 0 at the beginning and the end of your dash. But movement in the finals is fundamentally very momentum driven. To better accommodate this, the finals stores the velocity you had before you dashed, and then sets your velocity to that number at the end of it. So let's try applying that idea to the velocity we get from a lunge. Okay, now we're cooking, but we can do much more than that. You can think of actions in the finals as either being performed with your feet or with your hands. And since dashing is performed with the former, it doesn't interrupt any part of your slash or lunge animations. Meaning you can dash at any point during or after the charge or release of a lunge, and you'll get different effects depending on which. To stay safer during your lunge's vulnerable charge-up period, simply dash into your opponent's blind spot. After that, you'll only be waiting a split second longer before your lunge is ready to go. You can also dash long after the lunge has already been released. Not only is this a surefire way to break some ankles, but thanks to the lunge attack's lingering hitbox, you can lunge perpendicular to an enemy and then dash back into them for a late hit. But you only get 3 dashes, with a cooldown time that feels very similar to Tracer's from Overwatch. But as a melee character, movement isn't only vital for dealing consistent damage, but it's also how we stay alive. If you spend more than half a second anywhere other than your opponent's blind spot, you're going to be a pile of coins in no time. And if we need to either lunge or dash every time we want to change direction, we're going to be out of resources pretty fast. There's obviously a lot of strategy involved in this, and while we will go more in depth on that later in the video, we need to build an understanding of all the individual pieces before we can start talking about how they fit together. So how can we supplement our movement? We already have options for covering large amounts of ground relatively quickly. But in the heat of a chaotic gunfight, we're going to need something that lets us turn on a dime without spending a critical resource. That is where so-called tap strafing comes in. If you play any Source derivative games, you'll understand why I say so-called there. Simply put, there's already something we call tap strafing, and this ain't it. The The reason it's called tap strafing, at least as far as I can tell, is that it lets us manipulate the velocity vector of our character in a similar way. So as you can see, we can slide in the finals. I don't feel like this one really needs an explanation. If you're watching this video, you've probably played a video game before. One key property of the finals sliding system is that it will not give you this burst of speed if you've recently performed a movement action like jumping, landing, changing direction, or sprinting. Ostensibly, this is a system that was put in to make people easier to hit during gunfights. It makes the game more fair and more balanced for everyone. So obviously, as a sword player, our job is to circumvent that. The simplest way to do this is by internalizing the time it takes for our character to return to its normal movement state after performing one of the aforementioned movement actions. This is a really nice piece of skill expression. The more confident you are with your timing, the less time you have to wait in that vulnerable, slow-moving state before you initiate a slide. But sliding is also one of those actions that puts us in the state where we can't turn or change direction as easily. What allows us to tap strafe is that there's a very brief window at the end of a slide where that state has ended, but we still have our sliding momentum. So by pointing our camera in the direction we want to go during the slide and then jumping in the very brief window afterwards, we can do this. This is a great mechanic. If you input your jump just a hair too early or too late, you'll get a dead jump and be a very easy target. But if you master the timing, you'll be able to zip around people's ankles like insert basketball player here. This means an experienced sword player has 4 different options for quickly changing their momentum during a fight. And every single one of those momentum changes wastes the opponent's time and, more importantly, their ammo. Everyone has to reload eventually. Everyone except you. So at this point we have 4 basic mechanics. There's a slash, lunge, dash, and tap strafe. Each of these can be mastered on their own, but when combined, there is hundreds of hours of depth to explore. But the lid is going to get blown right off when I introduce the 5th basic mechanic of the sword. Let's go back and look at those damage numbers one more time. The light class has 150 health, the medium 250, and heavy 350. So why the hell does the light attack do 74 damage? And why is the lunge 140 instead of an even and obvious 150? Well, when you're balancing a multiplayer game, you don't really balance around the numbers. Instead, game designers are more interested in what are called breakpoints. Essentially, a number can go up linearly, but a certain gameplay effect might only happen once that number goes above a certain threshold. A prime example is Genji's Dragon Blade from Overwatch. If Ana applies her nano boost to Genji during the blade, Tesco value Jack from Ghost Runner will gain 30% extra damage. This is just enough to make 1 slash and 1 dash do enough damage to kill a squishy target. In fact, the whole reason Nano Boost is better on some heroes than it is on others is because of how it affects that character's breakpoints. And since the difference between killing a light in 3 shots versus 2 is essentially a rounding error, any amount of extra damage in that time would result in a faster kill. Unfortunately for us, our 2 main attacks have cooldown periods. For a fraction of a second after either of those attacks, you cannot initiate any other offensive action. But that rule has one key exception: the quick melee. Like sliding and tap strafing, this is a universal mechanic accessible to every class. It's also similar to tap strafing in that it's particularly relevant when using the sword. For most classes, the ability to apply 40 damage instantly but only at very close range is kind of an afterthought. But for reasons you've probably figured out already, look at you, aren't you clever? Hitting even a single quick melee is going to fundamentally change our approach to every single fight. For one, we can now kill light players pretty much instantly. I'd argue this interaction is pretty fun for everyone involved. It is very hard to hit these on a moving target, and your opponent only has to bamboozle you 1 time to get more than enough of a window to finish the fight. But I think it speaks volumes that in only 10 minutes we've gone from killing a light in 3 hits at this range to killing them instantly at this range. As with nearly all modern games, the Finals has a very generous input leniency system. In short, these are systems that are designed to convert a player's input into a gameplay state in a way that recognizes their intentions over their exact input timings. It's basically a way of bridging the gap between perfect logical machine code and imperfect humans. Except you, of course, you're perfect. But accessible design benefits everybody. That's as true for elevators and ramps as it is for input windows. If you build a ramp, someone will eventually do a kickflip off it. The sword's equivalent of a kickflip is the wonderfully named Phantom Strike. After performing a light or a heavy attack, we won't be able to input another attack for a certain amount of time. But due to the slash and lunge both having slightly different input leniency values, there is a very precise sequence of inputs that allows us to bring out the hitbox for a light attack whilst also charging a lunge. The Phantom Strike has two variants, which in this video I'll be calling the Light Phantom and the Heavy Phantom. Since a Phantom Strike can only be performed after an attack, I'm drawing a distinction here based solely off of which attack you started with. And the way to think about them is that they are supercharged versions of melee cancels. Now, I haven't done a lot of testing off of this, but just going off of feel, the slash has about a 10 frame window where you can begin the input for a Phantom Strike, and the lunge's window is about 20 frames. Despite that, I actually find the Heavy Phantom much more challenging than the Light Phantom. This is because the input window out of a lunge begins much later than it does out of a slash. So not only is it much harder to internalize the timing, but you also have to commit to moving in one direction for just a split second longer than might be comfortable. The moment you initiate a Phantom Strike input, that's you committed. The entire input string is complete long before you see the fruits of your labor. And that extra fraction of a second of downtime can feel like a painful eternity. Because Phantom Striking is something that's only really reserved for the top sword players. By the very nature of its difficulty of execution, by the time you start to work it into your playstyle, you're going to be up against players who really know what they're doing. After initiating the input string by holding light attack, you then have to begin holding lunge and then quickly tap light attack again, all within a very precise window. To even attempt it, you have to commit to planting yourself right at your opponent's feet. But the extremely high risk of catastrophic failure is outweighed by a much faster time to kill, especially against heavies. To kill a heavy, we need 2 lunges and a slash. Here's what that looks like without a Phantom Strike, and here is with. The Light Phantom has a similar effect in the fight against a medium, where the Heavy Phantom hits with 2 lunges and 1 slash in the time it takes to do 2 lunges. The Light Phantom sneaks in an entire extra lunge in the time it takes to do 2 slashes. This tech is insane. Its tight execution window and steep punishment for failure make it a very risky thing to go for. But with the possibility of doubling our effective DPS in certain situations, as well as having people in the private Discord think you're cool, is more than enough to justify the risk for some players. And knowing what combo to pick for any given situation, based on the information you know and your own skill level, gives every individual player the space they need to carve out their own individual playstyle. And don't forget, this is a team game with macro and strategy. And as the most mobile build in the game, a lot of that has to be facilitated by you. Especially since, as a light player, it's pretty much universally accepted that you're playing as the weakest class in the game. I would say what I've described so far to you is a pretty good weapon. It has a pretty high skill floor and a reasonably high skill ceiling in a game that's already incredibly deep. And while other players will be increasing their effective DPS by working on their aim, your learning curve is much more similar to a fighting game. On top of the macro strategy and cooldown management that every player has to engage with if they want to get good at the game, you have an entirely separate learning curve that revolves around spacing, animation cancels, and hit confirms. This is the version of the sword that the developers intended to create. It's a fun gimmick weapon with an interesting playstyle. It's good for players who want to try something different, but it's not going to be the main thing that attracts them to the finals. And its power curve is designed in such a way that it's not really going to impact the meta at either a casual or a high level. This is the part where you look at the video's runtime. Hey, listen, I warned you. I told you this rabbit hole goes deep. And you're already 10 minutes in, so sunk cost fallacy dictates that you stick it out to the end. So let me finally reveal what's in the 6th box. Okay, you ready? It's an ad?
What?
Statistically, that joke only worked on like 40% of you, so anyway, if the 6th mechanic isn't in that box, where is it? Well, the truth is, it's been in front of you the whole time. Look at this clip. Enhance. Apply JPEG compression. Adjust the content aware scale. Ah, yes, that's it. I'm emoting. Wait, seriously? This is what the entire second half of the video is about? Why do you have a voice line bound to mouse wheel down? Well, expressions in the finals are actions that you perform with your hands. And since they're not supposed to affect gameplay, the developers never saw the need to put in any checks to determine whether or not you could perform one. But it does affect gameplay, and in a pretty substantial way. Remember earlier in the video when I said both your basic attacks have some end lag, and during that time you can't perform any other offensive actions? Well, if we interrupt that end lag, for example by swapping weapons or performing an emote, upon swapping back to our weapon, that state is completely reset. This means we can effectively cancel any action at any time. Doing so immediately removes any debuffs associated with performing those attacks, but it also removes that attack's hitbox. Done optimally, you'll press and release the expression key the moment after your blade hits the target. After you've cancelled, you can start charging your next lunge immediately. But do it just a split second too early, and you effectively hit your opponent with a voice line. But the implications of being able to cancel the end lag of a move that is balanced primarily through its end lag are not hard to see. For one, it increases our potential damage per second substantially. The drawback being, if you misjudge your timing, you just hurtled yourself towards your enemy with no damage. But that's something you can get around with enough practice. Granted, it takes an awful lot of time, but it can be done. Its second benefit lies in your increased capacity for burst movement. As we've discussed, quickly changing direction is one of your primary tools for survival in the finals. So a decrease in the amount of time it takes to perform a lunge gives you way more survivability, even if you cancel too early and end up doing very little damage. It also interacts with other elements of your movement kit. Remember that movement debuff you get after performing a lunge? Well, we can now circumvent that too, allowing us to perform crazy tight maneuvers like this. But emote cancelling, as it's come to be called, is deceptively tricky to learn. You will very often cancel too early, oftentimes out of nerves or lack of confidence. And you'll only really start to see the benefits after weeks and weeks of hitting your opponents with a wet fish. And for a certain subset of players, this skill curve is incredibly engaging. It feels like the high-risk, high-reward identity of Sword taken to its logical extreme. And at higher levels of play, where people can aim and move much more effectively, it really doesn't break the game. It's awesome that Sword is playable in Diamond. And no matter how strong the Sword gets, not being able to hit somebody from range is always going to put you at a massive disadvantage, right? So why is it that whenever I post a clip of me playing Sword on Reddit, I see responses like this? Well, by its very nature, most of the clips you've seen in this video are from the Sword user's point of view. But let's get a little empathetic for a second. Imagine yourself on the receiving end of this. This person got taken out of the round pretty much instantly. There was almost nothing they could have done to react. And sure, I played that engagement pretty well, those were some really tight inputs resulting in a very fast double lunge. But this player put up a great fight for the rest of the game, and I can confidently say they're at a similar skill level to me. The problem is, the skills this player would have had to perform to survive this engagement are much more advanced than the skills I had to perform in it. They would have needed game sense and reaction times much more befitting of a Diamond player than a mid to low Plat one. And as precise and technical as emote cancelling can be, it's only really one input. And although I am punished for being a few frames early, I'm not punished anywhere near as harshly for being a few frames late. And even if I do miss my input, I still get the movement of a lunge. And since I'm already going to be inputting my next lunge by the time I've gone through him, I'm still at a pretty significant advantage even if I mess up. So them's the facts. What do we do about it? Well, if you've been following this discourse so far, you're probably already done typing your comment. You should press enter, by the way. Any sort of interaction with the video helps massively in the algorithm. For those who don't know, at time of recording, Embark are actively looking into this situation. They've already applied a band-aid fix to emote cancelling. And although it only took me about an hour to find a workaround, and there is always its little brother switch cancelling, both of these options feel strenuous, clunky, and unfun in comparison. Switch cancelling is its own thing, and I'm not really a switch cancel main, so I can't really talk about it. Here are some people that can. But the main difference is where emote cancel takes one scroll input, switch cancelling takes a scroll input plus another input. The second input is you switching back to your primary weapon. Switching to anything in the finals briefly puts you in a state where you can't perform any actions with that item. This puts a hard limit on how quickly you can begin charging a lunge after performing this cancel. That difference may be small, but it actually makes switch cancelling a much more fair implementation. And if you mistime any of the inputs by even a fraction of a second, you'll end up throwing a grenade or something. So not only is it much harder, but it's also a little bit slower. The method I found is a little bit more similar to the emote cancel. Instead of cancelling with an expression, we cancel using a voice line from the communications wheel. What makes this input suck is that it locks your camera while the communications wheel is open. I did manage to get pretty good at them by nailing down the timing and putting my communications wheel on mouse 1 of all places so that I could slam it down and have my finger bounce off. When I was able to get into the rhythm of it, it genuinely felt a little bit easier than emote cancelling. I propose we call this one hype cancelling, by the way, because to get the cancel to go off, you actually have to trigger a voice line. So to your teammates, it looks like you're spamming hype in the middle of every fight, which is kind of funny at first, but really annoying after a while. Both of these have their problems. With hype cancelling, even if you get quite good at it, having your camera locked for any amount of time is necessarily going to throw off your aim, which just does not feel good. Switch cancelling is a little bit closer to what I would consider ideal, but let me explain the inputs to you and you tell me if you think it sounds fun. To make this as easy on ourselves as we can, we're going to want switching back to our weapon to be our most accessible button. So I'm again going to use mouse 1 for something other than primary fire here. Even if you don't use this specific setup, you will inevitably end up sacrificing some core functionality that you need to play other characters in pursuit of maximal sword gameplay. So we hit our opponent with a lunge attack. To cancel into our next lunge, we first have to press and release next item. Now you specifically need a binding for next item here, so that means assigning 2 of our primary buttons to non-primary actions. This is because if you've spent a cooldown, you cannot switch to that item. So the alternative would be learning and practicing 3 different muscle memories for you to swap in and out depending on what you have available. The most efficient setup I found for this was next item on mouse wheel down and weapon 1 on mouse wheel up. But if I input next item even a split second after I input weapon 1, I'm going to be caught with my tail between my legs. Personally, I do not find this very fun, but again, go check out some of these guys if you want a second opinion. The other reason it feels clunky is it's a lot harder to cancel the movement debuff at the end of a lunge. I think pretty much everyone can agree that the damage on vanilla emote cancelling was too much, but the movement felt amazing. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, Embark are actively looking into this situation. So I thought we should explore some potential solutions. Not only as a fun game design experiment, but also as an avid fan, making an argument for why the thing he really loves should continue to exist in some way. Who knows, maybe this video will do well enough for some people at Embark to see it. So here is my proposal. Games like Apex Legends and Titanfall have proven that you can create massively compelling gameplay when you treat these discovered mechanics with care and nuance. And we already know that Embark do extensive testing on all of their new features and balance changes that they make. But for whatever reason, it feels like anytime there's a discovered mechanic in the game, it just gets deleted. For things like nukes, this was pretty unanimously considered a good thing. But when super gliding was patched out, that reception was a lot less unanimous. What I'm getting at is there is a middle ground here. An implementation that would allow Sword to maintain its status as one of the most interesting parts of the game, without having this uncontrollable power curve. Unpacking the finals' melee state handling system is far outside the scope of this video, but Embark devs, if you're watching, just between you and me, let's be real, the fundamental bug that leads to emote cancelling isn't going anywhere. And given the opportunity, a YouTube video essayist will quote Soren Johnson. So instead of being in this arms race where we're constantly trying to outdo each other by finding and patching out new cancels, let's just make it its own mechanic. Hashtag make optimal fun again. The reload key is already going unused on Sword, and I think we can arrive at an implementation that accentuates what makes it fun, whilst giving you some new levers to pull to rein it in. So here's a design doc that you didn't ask for. Behold, the feint attack. Much tighter execution window, all of the movement buff, much less of the damage buff. On top of that, it gets its own sound and particle effect, so for the majority of players who can't hit that really precise input window, they get to do the dance with no damage. This allows for a lot of mix-up potential, whilst also communicating to the receiving player what exactly is going on. For a very skilled player, they can get the damage off whilst getting a marginally faster lunge. Doing this sacrifices the movement bonus of an early cancel, and missing it will leave you dead in your tracks with no active hitbox. You can adjust both the timing window and the minimum time till next lunge independently. This still leaves room for us to have our ridiculous arms race, but I don't think anyone's going to be breaking the meta with marginally better but much harder tech. It also means people could switch characters and weapons freely without having to change their controls, and it means sword users don't have an increased likelihood of arthritis and carpal tunnel. So that's it, that's my proposal. Embark, while I have your attention, you've been making a lot of changes to the invis mechanic since release. Here's my 2 cents, which coincidentally will buy you 1 hour of QA in Canada. The invis mechanic is just a fundamentally poor design. Partial invisibility as a game mechanic is susceptible not only to people's hardware configurations, but also their eyesight. When you're engaging on a fight with invis, the question should not be, how good is my opponent's eyesight? Let's just copy it from Overwatch. You are either completely invisible or not at all. To perform any offensive action, you first have to wait for the uncloak animation to finish. I love you guys, I really do, but for the majority of the game's lifespan, you've been able to instantly win any fight by hitting someone with stun gun while invisible. Second, and this one is just for me personally, if I quick melee a red canister, it shouldn't wobble. I just want to be able to prop surf while using a sword. And finally, the current melee multi-hit bug will almost certainly be patched out by the time this video goes live. But it definitely opens up interesting design space on Sword, design space that I'm sure you've explored plenty internally. For the rest of you, you know the drill by now. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. If you want to offer a sacrifice to the great YouTube algorithm, please feel free to do so. If you want to play stuff I've released, it's available for free on itch. If you want to play stuff I haven't released, it's available for money on Patreon. Give me your firstborn child, overthrow your local post office, and have a nice day.